The cold billionaire had to marry in a week to keep his fortune. But when he met an activist, the Miami skyline cast long shadows across the crumbling facade of Sunnyside Community Center as Michael Johnson stood motionless, watching bulldozers line up like metal predators poised to strike. His designer suit felt suffocating in the humid air, a reminder of the world he belonged to or thought he belonged to until a week ago. A child's drawing fluttered past his feet, torn from the walls inside a crayon masterpiece of smiling stick figures holding hands around what was clearly meant to be this very building. 7 days. It had only been 7 days since his grandfather's letter arrived, its contents shattering the carefully constructed reality of his life. The words still burned in his mind: to inherit the family fortune and maintain your position as majority shareholder of Lancaster Consortium. You must be married within 1 week to someone you truly love. At first it had seemed like a cruel joke, then an impossible challenge. Now, standing here, it felt like fate's twisted way of leading him to this moment. Stop. You can't do this, a voice cut through the mechanical growl of engines. Michael turned to see a woman rushing toward the fence, dark hair escaping a hasty bun, eyes blazing with a passion that stopped him cold. Behind her, a group of residents gathered, elderly couples clutching each other's hands, parents holding children close, teenagers with defiant expressions. But it was her he couldn't look away from. This community center saved my family, she continued, moving closer, seemingly unafraid of his position or power. It saved dozens of families. If you destroy it, you're destroying people's last hope. There was something in her voice, in her fierce determination, that stirred a memory he'd long buried of his sister Emily, before the accident, fighting just as passionately for what she believed in. The woman was close enough now that Michael could see unshed tears in her eyes, though her voice remained steady. "I'm Samantha Davis, and I won't let you destroy Sunnyside without a fight." The words hung in the air between them, a challenge and a prophecy rolled into one. Little did either of them know that this moment would set in motion a chain of events that would unravel decades of secrets, expose bitter betrayals, and test the very foundations of what both of them believed about love, loyalty, and redemption. The Lancaster Consortium building pierced the Miami sky like a glass sword, its 50 stories a testament to 3 generations of Johnson family ambition. In his top-floor office, Michael Johnson stood before floor-to-ceiling windows, a king surveying his domain. At 38, he'd earned his salt and pepper hair and the weight of responsibility that came with being CEO of Miami's largest real estate development company. But today that weight felt heavier than usual. His fingers traced the edge of an old photograph on his desk, a family portrait from happier times. His father James, stern and proud; his mother Catherine, elegant and distant; his younger sister Emily, her smile bright and unguarded. Emily, who he'd failed to protect, whose absence still haunted the halls of their family mansion. "Your 9 a.m. is here," his assistant Sarah announced through the intercom, interrupting his reverie. "Victoria Sinclair from Sinclair Developments." The name alone made his jaw clench. Victoria, his former fiancée, and the architect of his greatest professional humiliation. 5 years ago, she'd nearly destroyed the Johnson legacy, using their engagement to gain access to sensitive company information before attempting a hostile takeover. The betrayal had cost Lancaster Consortium millions and taught Michael a brutal lesson about mixing business with pleasure. He'd met Victoria at a charity gala, much like the ones he now avoided. She'd been brilliant, ambitious, and as cold as the diamonds she wore. Their courtship had been more merger than romance, a calculated alliance between 2 powerful families. Looking back, he should have seen the signs: her pointed questions about company strategy, her late-night visits to his office, the mysterious calls she'd dodge. The takeover attempt had failed, but the damage was done. His father had suffered a heart attack from the stress, eventually stepping down and leaving Michael to rebuild the company's reputation. More than the financial loss, It was the look in his father's eyes, disappointment mixed with resignation, that had hardened something inside Michael. Since then, he'd focused solely on business, earning a reputation as Miami's most ruthless developer. The Ice King, they called him in boardrooms and society pages alike. He'd worn the title like armor, letting it shield him from anything that might compromise his judgment or threaten the empire he'd sworn to protect. His grandfather Arthur had been the only one to object to this transformation. Success without purpose is just sophisticated failure, the old man would say, his eyes heavy with wisdom earned through decades of building the company from nothing. But Michael had dismissed these concerns as the sentimentality of age. Business was business. There was no room for heart in real estate development. Now, staring at the expansion plans for the Sunnyside district, Michael saw everything with perfect clarity. Each acquisition, each development, each urban renewal project had only served to distance him further from the values his grandfather had tried to instill. The Ice King had become exactly what Victoria had once accused him of being, a man who valued profit above all else. The intercom buzzed again. "Mr. Johnson?" "Victoria's waiting." Michael straightened his tie, his reflection in the window transforming into the mask of corporate indifference he'd perfected. "Send her in," he replied, pushing thoughts of the past aside. He had an empire to protect, a legacy to uphold. Or so he thought, unaware that his grandfather's letter would soon shatter every certainty he'd built his life upon. Samantha Davis sat in her small office at Sunnyside Community Center, the evening light casting shadows across photographs that told stories of lives transformed. But one photo, tucked in her desk drawer, told a different story. Her father, Thomas Davis, standing proudly in front of Davis Sons Construction, just weeks before Lancaster Consortium's hostile takeover had destroyed everything. 10 years ago, her father had been a respected contractor, building homes rather than empires. The Davis family wasn't wealthy, but they were happy. Samantha had been in her final year of college. Her brother Jimmy was excelling in physical therapy, despite his cerebral palsy, and their mother Helen managed to keep everyone's spirits high despite her ongoing battle with lupus. Then came the letter from Lancaster Consortium. What had seemed like a dream partnership quickly turned into a nightmare. The Johnsons' company had promised to save her father's struggling business, offering a merger that would secure jobs for all his employees. Instead, they'd stripped the company bare, sold off its assets, and left 50 families without income. The betrayal had broken her father. "You can't trust people who view the world through spreadsheets," he'd told her the night before his heart attack. "They don't see the human cost of their decisions." She'd found him in his study the next morning, surrounded by unpaid medical bills for Jimmy's treatments and final notices from the bank. The funeral had been small. They couldn't afford more. Samantha had dropped out of college to care for Jimmy and their mother, whose condition worsened with the stress. She'd worked 3 jobs, studied social work at night, and spent every spare moment at Sunnyside Community Center, which had become their lifeline. The center had offered free physical therapy for Jimmy, support groups for their mother, and a community that refused to let them fall through the cracks. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly program director, had taken Samantha under her wing, teaching her that true strength lay not in wealth or power, but in the ability to help others, even when you were hurting yourself. "Your father built houses," Mrs. Henderson had said, "but you, my dear, you build hope." Now, a decade later, Samantha ran Sunnyside's family support programs, turning her pain into purpose. Jimmy had graduated high school with honors, defying every doctor's prediction, and their mother's condition had stabilized thanks to the center's medical assistance program. But the wound Lancaster Consortium had inflicted never fully healed. She'd followed Michael Johnson's career from afar, watching as he transformed from the privileged son into Miami's most ruthless developer. Each news article about another community displaced, another neighborhood revitalized into unaffordable luxury condos, had stoked the embers of her resolve. Samantha opened her desk drawer, touching the old photograph. "I won't let them do to other families what they did to us, Dad," she whispered. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now faced off against the very man whose company had destroyed her family. But this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about protecting the community that had saved her when she needed it most. Outside her office window, children laughed in Sunnyside's playground, elderly residents tended the community garden, and teenagers helped younger kids with homework. This was what real value looked like, not in property assessments or profit margins, but in lives touched and hope restored. And Samantha Davis would fight with everything she had to preserve it. Sunnyside Community Center stood like a weathered sentinel in one of Miami's oldest neighborhoods, its brick facade telling stories of decades of service. What the building lacked in modern amenities, it made up for in the warmth that emanated from within. The aroma of fresh coffee from the community kitchen mingled with the sound of children's laughter, creating an atmosphere that felt more like home than institution. Inside, every room pulsed with purpose. The main hall hosted everything from ESL classes for immigrant families to dance lessons for seniors. Computer labs, staffed by volunteer tutors, helped job seekers craft resumes and teenagers complete homework. The medical clinic, though modest, provided basic care to those who would otherwise go without. Jake Martinez, a 16-year-old who'd found refuge at Sunnyside after his mother's death, represented the center's impact. 3 years ago, he'd been on the verge of dropping out, anger and grief pushing him toward the streets. Now, he tutored younger kids in mathematics, his own grades having improved enough to dream of college. This place, he often said, it doesn't just give you help, it gives you hope. Maria Rodriguez managed the community kitchen, turning donated supplies into nutritious meals that fed both body and soul. At 72, she'd seen the neighborhood change, watched as gentrification crept closer like an incoming tide. Yet Sunnyside remained constant, a beacon for families struggling to maintain dignity in an increasingly unaffordable city. The center's heart beat strongest in its smallest moments, Mrs. Henderson teaching a young mother to read while her children played nearby, veteran Bob Williams sharing his gardening wisdom in the community plot, nurse Sarah Chen checking blood pressure for elderly residents who treated her like family. These daily acts of kindness created a tapestry of support that money couldn't buy. Each evening, as Miami's glittering towers cast long shadows over the neighborhood, Sunnyside transformed again. The classrooms filled with adult education students chasing better futures. The gym echoed with the sounds of youth basketball leagues keeping kids off the streets. The counseling rooms provided safe spaces for support groups where struggles shared became burdens halved. Even the building's limitations, the leaky roof, the temperamental heating system, the cramped spaces had become part of its character. When something broke, the community fixed it together. Local handyman George Parker traded maintenance work for his daughter's after-school care. Retired electrician Tom Foster kept the lights on in exchange for warm meals and companionship. The threat of demolition hung over Sunnyside like a storm cloud, but its community remained resilient. They'd weathered previous challenges through unity and determination. Weekly planning meetings now focused on survival strategies, with residents contributing what little they could to emergency funds. Children made Save Our Sunnyside posters, while teenagers organized social media campaigns. For people like Emma Chen, a single mother working 2 jobs, Sunnyside meant the difference between survival and despair. The center's childcare program allowed her to work without worry. Or for elderly residents like the Wilsons, who'd lost their savings to medical bills, the center's food bank and social activities provided both sustenance and purpose. As darkness fell each night, Sunnyside's windows glowed like beacons, each light representing a story of hope, struggle, and perseverance. The center stood as living proof that a community's worth couldn't be measured in property values or profit margins. It was measured in lives transformed, in friendships forged, in the unshakable belief that everyone deserved a chance to thrive. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Michael Johnson's penthouse as he held his grandfather's letter, reading it for the 100th time. Arthur Johnson's distinctive handwriting, once a symbol of authority and wisdom, now seemed to mock him with its elegant curves and deliberate strokes. My dear Michael, the letter began, as I approach the end of my journey, I find myself reflecting on what truly matters in life. The empire we've built is impressive. But what good is a legacy without love to share it? It is with this in mind that I have made a decision that will shape your future and the future of Lancaster Consortium. Michael's hands trembled slightly as he reached the crucial paragraph. Therefore, I have added a final clause to my will to inherit the family fortune and maintain your position as majority shareholder of Lancaster Consortium. You must be married within 1 week to someone you truly love. Not a marriage of convenience, Michael, but a union born of genuine affection and shared values. If you fail to meet this condition, your shares will be divided among the board members and the family fortune will be donated to charity. The letter continued, revealing deeper layers of his grandfather's intent. I've watched you build walls around your heart since Victoria's betrayal and Emily's accident. You've become exactly what I feared, a man who measures success solely in profit margins. This ultimatum isn't just about marriage, Michael. It's about rediscovering the person you were meant to be. Harold Finch, his grandfather's lawyer, had delivered the letter personally, along with a ticking countdown to absolute upheaval. Your grandfather was very specific about the timeline, Finch had explained, his expression carefully neutral. 7 days from today, at midnight. The board has already been notified of the potential leadership change. The implications were staggering. Lancaster Consortium, the company he'd given his life to protect and expand, could slip through his fingers. The Johnson legacy, built over 3 generations, might end with him. Everything he'd worked for, every sacrifice he'd made, could amount to nothing. Michael poured himself a scotch, despite the early hour. His grandfather had always been unconventional in his methods, but this was beyond anything he could have anticipated. Find true love in a week. It seemed like a cruel joke, a final test designed to prove his unworthiness. The timing couldn't have been worse. The Sunnyside development project represented the largest deal in the company's history. The board was watching closely, waiting to see if he could handle the community resistance and secure the property. Now, instead of focusing on business, he was supposed to be searching for love. His phone buzzed with messages from board members, each one a barely veiled inquiry about his plans. They could smell blood in the water, these corporate sharks who'd waited years for a chance to seize control. The thought of Richard Hawthorne or Victoria Sinclair getting their hands on his family's company made his stomach turn. 7 days to find love. 7 days to protect his legacy. 7 days to prove himself worthy of his grandfather's vision. The weight of the impossible choice pressed down on him like a physical force. How could he possibly focus on matters of the heart when everything he'd built was at risk? The irony wasn't lost on him that his grandfather's final lesson might cost him the very empire the old man had created. But as he stared out at the Miami skyline, Michael Johnson realized that the real test might not be about finding love at all, but about discovering what truly mattered in life. Michael Johnson sat in his office, the Sunnyside development plans spread before him, each page representing millions in potential profit and dozens of lives upended. The afternoon sun cast his shadow across documents that once seemed so straightforward: acquisition reports, displacement statistics, projected revenues. Now, each number carried the weight of his grandfather's challenge and his own growing doubts. His father's voice echoed in his memory. Business isn't personal, Michael. The moment you let emotion cloud your judgment is the moment you lose everything. Those words had been his mantra since taking over as CEO, a shield against the human cost of corporate decisions. But now, studying the photographs of Sunnyside Community Center, he couldn't ignore the faces behind the figures. The quarterly report on his desk showed record profits, each successful development adding to the Johnson legacy. Yet his grandfather's words haunted him: what good is a legacy without love to share it? The old man had built Lancaster Consortium from nothing, but he'd never let success hollow out his humanity. Michael remembered childhood visits to construction sites, watching his grandfather chat with workers, learn their stories, ensure their families were cared for. When had he strayed so far from those values? The Victoria incident had hardened him, certainly. Emily's loss had sealed his emotional vault. But looking at his reflection in the window, Michael barely recognized the man he'd become. The Ice King of Miami real estate, they called him. A title he'd worn with pride, never realizing it might be a warning rather than an accolade. Sarah, his assistant, interrupted his thoughts with coffee and a stack of community impact assessments. "The board's asking for your final decision on Sunnyside by tomorrow," she said, her tone careful. She'd worked with him long enough to read his moods. They're concerned about any delay affecting the shareholders. Shareholders. The word hit him differently now. Who were the true stakeholders in this decision? The investors watching their portfolios grow, or the families who called Sunnyside home? His grandfather's ultimatum forced him to question everything he'd accepted as necessary business practice. The photos on his desk told two stories, one of potential luxury condos rising from cleared land, promising unprecedented returns, the other of a community center's daily miracles, children learning, elderly finding purpose, families supporting each other through hard times. Both represented value, but of vastly different kinds. His phone buzzed with messages from board members, each one pressing for action on Sunnyside. Richard Hawthorne's text was particularly pointed: "Don't let sentiment cloud your judgment, Johnson. Remember what happened to your father." The threat was clear show weakness, and the sharks would circle. Michael stood, walking to the window. The Miami skyline sparkled in the distance, each gleaming tower a testament to profitable decisions, to choosing business over humanity. But at what cost? His grandfather's ultimatum wasn't just about finding love, it was about rediscovering the heart he'd locked away. A maintenance worker washed the windows of the building across the street, suspended high above the ground. 10 years ago, Michael would have known that man's name, asked about his family. Now, he saw only liability insurance and labor costs. The realization struck him like a physical blow. Could he reconcile the ruthless businessman he'd become with the compassionate leader his grandfather envisioned? The answer to that question might determine not just his inheritance, but the kind of man he would be for the rest of his life. The first direct confrontation between Michael Johnson and Samantha Davis erupted in Sunnyside's main hall during what was supposed to be a routine community meeting. Michael had arrived unannounced, expecting to deliver a polished presentation about Lancaster Consortium's urban renewal initiative. Instead, he found himself facing a room full of residents led by a woman whose fierce determination matched his own. "Mr. Johnson," Samantha's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd, "you talk about progress and development, but let's be honest about what those words really mean. You're not here to renew our community, you're here to destroy it." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Michael adjusted his tie, maintaining his practiced corporate composure. "Ms. Davis, I understand your emotional attachment to this building, but business decisions can't be based on sentiment. The economic reality." "Economic reality," Samantha interrupted, stepping closer. "Let me show you reality, Mr. Johnson," she gestured to the people around them. Maria Rodriguez, who feeds 30 hungry children every day. Jake Martinez, who went from potential dropout to honor student because of our tutoring program. The Williams family, who'd be homeless without our emergency housing assistance. Michael felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon him, each gaze challenging the carefully constructed walls of his business persona. The development will create jobs, increase property values. "Jobs we can't qualify for and homes we can't afford," Samantha countered, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. "But you'd know that if you'd ever bothered to learn about the community you're so eager to displace? Or did you forget what happened to Davis Sons Construction 10 years ago? The name hit Michael like a physical blow. Memories flooded back: board meetings, acquisition papers, his father's cold calculations. That was a legitimate business decision, he said, but the words felt hollow even to his own ears. That legitimate business decision killed my father, Samantha revealed, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Your company's hostile takeover destroyed not just his business, but his life's work. And now you're here to do the same thing to Sunnyside. The room fell silent. Michael stared at Samantha, really seeing her for the first time not just as an obstacle to development, but as someone whose life had been irrevocably altered by his family's actions. The weight of his grandfather's words about legacy and love seemed to press down on him with newfound force. "I'm sorry about your father," he said quietly, surprising himself with his sincerity. "But this development is already in motion, the board." "Save your apologies," Samantha cut in. "If you have any shred of humanity left beneath that expensive suit, come back tomorrow. Spend one day here. See what you're really destroying before you sign our death warrant." Their eyes locked in a moment of electric tension. Michael saw in her gaze not just anger, but something that shook him to his core, a passionate belief in something greater than profit margins. It reminded him painfully of his sister Emily, of his grandfather, of the person he used to be. One day he found himself saying, though it went against every business instinct he'd cultivated, "I'll give you one day to make your case." As he turned to leave, Samantha's voice followed him. "Tomorrow, then, Mr. Johnson. Let's see if the Ice King of Miami still has a heart to melt." Michael Johnson arrived at Sunnyside Community Center precisely at 7 a.m., having traded his customary suit for khakis and a button-down shirt. The morning light cast a different perspective on the building's weathered facade, highlighting not its decay but its resilience. Samantha Davis waited at the entrance, her expression a mixture of surprise and guarded approval at his punctuality. "Your first task," she announced, leading him to the community kitchen, "is helping Maria prepare breakfast for our children's program." Michael found himself rolling up his sleeves alongside a grandmother figure who commanded her kitchen with the authority he recognized from corporate boardrooms. Maria Rodriguez showed no deference to his status, simply handed him an apron and put him to work cracking eggs. "These children," Maria explained as she demonstrated the proper way to flip pancakes, "many come from homes where breakfast isn't guaranteed. Here they start their day with a full stomach and a warm smile." Michael watched as she transformed simple ingredients into nutritious meals, each plate prepared with evident care and love. The breakfast rush brought a parade of faces and stories. A young mother dropping off 2 children before her early hospital shift, teenagers grabbing quick meals before school, exchanging homework tips and gentle teasing. Elderly residents coming as much for the company as for the food. Each interaction challenged Michael's preconceptions about the community he'd planned to displace. As the morning progressed, Samantha moved him through different programs. In the computer lab, he helped Jake Martinez tutor younger students in mathematics. The teenager's patience and dedication struck a chord. Here was a young man who, despite limited resources, showed the kind of leadership Michael recognized from his most promising executives. Before Sunnyside, Jake confided during a quiet moment, "I was angry all the time. Lost my mum, Dad was never around. Mrs. Henderson and MS. Davis, they didn't just help me with homework, they showed me I could be more than my circumstances." The senior citizens art class proved particularly challenging to Michael's carefully maintained professional distance. Mrs. Wilson, a retired teacher battling arthritis, insisted he join her watercolor session. His clumsy attempts at painting drew gentle laughter, but also unexpected lessons in persistence and finding beauty in imperfection. In the afternoon, Michael found himself assisting with the center's job training program. Here, his business expertise proved genuinely useful as he reviewed resumes and conducted mock interviews. Each participant carried stories of setback and determination that made his own career challenges seem trivial by comparison. "You're different than I expected," Samantha observed during a brief break, passing him a cup of coffee from the community kitchen. "I thought you'd treat this like a formality, but you're actually engaging." Michael considered her words carefully. "I'm beginning to understand what my grandfather meant about legacy," he admitted. "This place, it's not just a building or programs, it's a family," Samantha finished softly. "A community where everyone has value beyond their economic contribution." The day's final activity brought Michael to the children's reading circle. Sitting on a worn carpet, surrounded by eager young faces, he found himself reading The Little Engine That Could with unexpected enthusiasm. Each child's reaction, their unwavering belief in possibility despite circumstances, stirred memories of reading the same story with his sister Emily. As evening approached, Michael stood in Sunnyside's main hall, watching families reunite after long workdays. The space hummed with life, with connections that defied monetary measurement. He thought of the development plans sitting on his desk, the cold calculations that had seemed so rational just yesterday. "Time's up," Samantha announced, approaching with a mix of curiosity and caution. "What verdict will the Ice King deliver to his board?" Michael turned to her, his carefully constructed worldview irrevocably altered. "I need more time," he said quietly. "There's more here than I understood. More than I can quantify in any development proposal." The evening light filtered through Sunnyside's windows as Michael and Samantha worked late, reviewing the center's financial records. What had begun as a professional assessment gradually shifted into something more personal as the hours wore on. They sat across from each other at her small desk, spreadsheets forgotten as conversation flowed naturally. "You're actually quite good with numbers," Michael observed, noticing how meticulously she tracked the center's limited resources. "You could have had a career in finance." Samantha looked up, a strand of hair falling loose from her practical bun. "I did briefly. Before my father," she paused, the old pain flickering across her face. "I was studying business administration when everything happened." Michael felt the familiar twist of guilt, but something else too: admiration for her resilience. "You rebuilt your life completely," he said softly. "That takes extraordinary strength." Their eyes met across the desk, and for a moment the air seemed charged with unspoken understanding. Samantha broke the contact first, gathering papers with slightly trembling hands. "We should check on the evening programs," she suggested. Walking through the center's corridors, they found themselves sharing memories. Michael spoke of his sister Emily, her passion for teaching before the accident. Samantha described her brother Jimmy's determination to overcome his physical challenges. Their shoulders brushed occasionally as they walked, each contact sending unexpected sparks through both of them. In the community garden, they paused to watch the sunset paint Miami's skyline. "Emily would have loved this place," Michael admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "She always said I was too focused on buildings, not enough on the people who lived in them." Samantha turned to him, really seeing the man beneath the corporate facade. "She sounds wise," she said gently. "What happened to her?" Michael's hands gripped the garden railing. "Car accident, 10 years ago. I was supposed to drive her to a student's house, but I was too busy with a merger meeting. She took a taxi." His voice trailed off. Without thinking, Samantha placed her hand over his. The gesture, meant to comfort, sent warmth spreading through both of them. "It wasn't your fault," she whispered. Their faces were close now, the dying sunlight casting shadows that softened their features. Michael found himself studying the determination in her eyes, the compassion that balanced her strength. Samantha noticed the vulnerability beneath his controlled exterior, the hint of the man he might have been, might still become. Mrs. Henderson's voice broke the moment. "You two are still here. The evening classes are finishing up." They stepped apart, both suddenly aware of how close they'd been standing. Samantha tucked her hair behind her ear, a nervous gesture that Michael found inexplicably endearing. "We were just reviewing the center's needs," she explained quickly. "Of course you were," dear Mrs. Henderson replied, her knowing smile suggesting she saw more than they intended to reveal. As they walked back inside, Michael and Samantha maintained a professional distance, but something had shifted between them. Every glance carried new weight, every accidental touch lingered a moment too long. They were both acutely aware of the complications, their opposing positions, their history, the impending decision about Sunnyside's future. "Same time tomorrow," Michael asked as they reached the entrance, surprising them both with his eagerness to return. Samantha hesitated, conscious of the dangerous territory they were entering. The community would appreciate that she answered carefully, though her eyes said more. Watching him leave, Samantha pressed her hand to her heart, feeling its betraying flutter. In his car, Michael sat for a long moment, his grandfather's ultimatum echoing in his mind along with newer, more confusing emotions. Both knew they were stepping onto treacherous ground, where personal feelings could complicate professional decisions in ways neither had anticipated. The Miami skyline sparkled through Sunnyside's windows as Michael and Samantha found themselves alone in the center's small library, long after the last evening program had ended. A forgotten grant proposal lay between them on the worn wooden table, but their conversation had drifted far from fundraising strategies. "Tell me about Victoria," Samantha said quietly, surprising them both with her directness. "Everyone in Miami's business circles knows the story, but I'd like to hear your version." Michael leaned back in his chair, his tie loosened, jacket discarded hours ago. "Victoria Sinclair," he began, the name still carrying echoes of old pain, "was everything I thought I wanted. Brilliant, ambitious, from the right social circle. Our engagement made perfect business sense." But Samantha prompted gently. "But she saw me as a stepping stone. Used our relationship to access sensitive company information, tried to orchestrate a hostile takeover." He smiled bitterly. "The Ice King of Miami was born the day the deal fell apart." Samantha studied his face in the dim light. "You built walls." "I built fortresses," he corrected. "Seemed safer that way. Until my grandfather's letter arrived." "What letter?" Samantha asked, noticing the sudden tension in his shoulders. Michael hesitated, then made a decision. "He gave me an ultimatum. Find true love and marry within a week, or lose my position at Lancaster Consortium. The deadline's in 3 days." Silence filled the space between them. Samantha processed this revelation, understanding flooding her features. "That's why you've been spending so much time here. You're looking for—" "I was," Michael interrupted, leaning forward. "At first. But Samantha, what I've found here, what you've shown me, it's become about so much more than that." Their eyes met across the table, neither able to look away. "Michael," Samantha began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something too. When my father died, I blamed Lancaster Consortium. Blamed you. I wanted revenge," he finished softly. She nodded, tears threatening. "I thought if I could get close enough, find something to use against you. But then I saw how you were with the children here. How you listened to our seniors' stories. The way you're trying to understand." Michael reached across the table, taking her hand. The touch sent electricity through both of them. "We've both been fighting old ghosts," he said, "both trying to protect ourselves from being hurt again." "And now?" Samantha asked, not pulling her hand away. "Now I'm terrified," he admitted. "Not of losing the company or my inheritance, but of losing this whatever's happening between us. Of making the wrong choice and destroying something precious before it has a chance to grow." Samantha squeezed his hand, her own vulnerability showing in her eyes. "I'm scared too. My whole life has been about protecting this community, these people. If I let myself feel something for you—" A distant siren wailed somewhere in the city, reminding them of the world beyond Sunnyside's walls. The world of board meetings and development plans, of deadlines and difficult choices. Yet in that moment, neither wanted to leave the quiet sanctuary they'd found in each other's company. "Whatever happens," Michael said finally, "with the development, with my grandfather's ultimatum, I want you to know that this is real. The most real thing I've felt in years." Samantha stood, but didn't let go of his hand. "Walk with me," she asked. There's something else you should see." As they left the library together, both understood that they'd crossed a line. The carefully maintained boundaries between them had crumbled, leaving them vulnerable but also strangely hopeful. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now they had this moment of honest connection. The Lancaster Consortium boardroom fell silent as Victoria Sinclair strode through the double doors, her Louboutin heels clicking against the marble floor with predatory precision. Michael, who had been presenting his revised vision for Sunnyside, felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. She hadn't changed, still elegant, still dangerous, her smile as sharp as a blade's edge. "I apologize for interrupting," Victoria announced, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But I believe the board needs to hear some rather concerning information about our dear CEO's recent activities." She placed a leather portfolio on the polished table, her red lacquered nails drumming against its surface. Richard Hawthorne, always quick to sense weakness, leaned forward. "Please, MS Sinclair, enlighten us." Victoria's smile widened as she withdrew several documents. "It seems Mr. Johnson has been spending considerable time at Sunnyside Community Centre, not conducting business, but rather engaging in what appears to be a romantic entanglement with one Samantha Davis, a woman with a documented vendetta against Lancaster Consortium." Michael maintained his composure, though his hands clenched beneath the table. MS Davis is a respected community leader. Any interaction with her has been purely professional. "Really?" Victoria's voice dripped with false concern. "These photographs suggest otherwise." She spread several images across the table. Michael and Samantha in the community garden, their faces close, her hand on his. "But more importantly, I've uncovered some troubling financial irregularities at Sunnyside. Misappropriated funds, questionable accounting practices." "That's impossible," Michael interjected, but Victoria continued smoothly. "Furthermore, my investigation reveals that MS Davis has a personal history with Lancaster Consortium, her father's company's bankruptcy, his subsequent death, all tied to decisions made by this very board. One might question whether her influence over our CEO stems from genuine feeling or calculated revenge." The board members exchanged meaningful glances. Janet Lee, usually Michael's strongest supporter, looked troubled. "Michael, is this true? About her father?" Before he could respond, Victoria delivered her coup de grace. "And let's not forget the timing. With Arthur Johnson's unusual ultimatum hanging over our CEO's head, one might wonder if this sudden interest in community development isn't simply a desperate attempt to maintain control of the company." Michael stood, his chair scraping back. "Everything you're insinuating is false. Sunnyside provides essential services to hundreds of families. Their financial records are transparent. Their work is vital." "Your grandfather's deadline is in 2 days, isn't it?" Michael, Victoria interrupted softly. "How convenient that you found someone to fulfill the marriage requirement just in time. Someone who coincidentally controls a property worth millions in potential development revenue." The boardroom erupted in murmurs. Michael watched as years of carefully built trust began to erode. Victoria moved in for the kill, producing more documents. "I propose an emergency vote," she announced. "To protect Lancaster Consortium's interests, we need to act decisively. First, to proceed immediately with the original Sunnyside development plan. Second, to launch a full investigation into both the community centre's finances and Mr. Johnson's relationship with MS Davis." Richard Hawthorne nodded approvingly. "I second the motion." Michael's mind raced, seeing the trap closing around him. If the board voted now, in this atmosphere of suspicion, everything he'd come to believe and everything he'd come to feel for Samantha would be tainted. "Before you vote," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos, "I suggest you consider the legal implications of acting without full due diligence. Victoria's evidence deserves proper scrutiny." Victoria's smile never wavered. "By all means, Michael, let's scrutinize everything, including your recent activities at Sunnyside. I'm sure the press would be fascinated by the story Lancaster Consortium's Ice King, melted by a woman with a grudge. As the board scheduled an emergency session for the following morning, Michael realized the true depth of Victoria's revenge. She hadn't just threatened his position or Sunnyside, she'd poisoned the very foundation of his growing relationship with Samantha. In the dimly lit records room of Lancaster Consortium, Michael sat surrounded by boxes of old acquisition files, his suit jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up as he searched through a decade of corporate history. Victoria's accusations had driven him here, desperate to understand the full truth about Thomas Davis's company. The file he sought was buried deep in a dusty banker's box, marked 2015 acquisitions. As he pulled out the manila folder labeled Davis Sons Construction, a smaller envelope fell to the floor. Inside he found photographs that made his blood run cold, his father James Johnson shaking hands with Thomas Davis, both men smiling at a groundbreaking ceremony. The acquisition documents told a story that differed sharply from the official narrative. Davis Sons hadn't been failing when Lancaster Consortium moved in. It had been temporarily cash-strapped due to delayed payments on government contracts. The company's fundamentals were sound, its reputation sterling. The hostile takeover hadn't been a necessary business decision, it had been a calculated move to eliminate competition for lucrative public housing contracts. Michael's hands trembled as he read his father's internal memos. Davis refuses to sell. Suggests applying pressure through banking channels. Another note, in his father's precise handwriting, ensured DS loan applications are denied. Contact Reynolds at First Miami, he owes us. The systematic destruction of Thomas Davis's company unfolded before him in clinical detail. Lancaster Consortium had leveraged its banking relationships to freeze Davis Sons' credit lines, delayed payments on existing contracts, and spread rumors about the company's stability. The final blow had been orchestrated through a series of shell companies, making it impossible for Davis to trace the attack back to its source. Michael found a newspaper clipping dated 1 week after the takeover. Local builder dies of heart attack. The photo showed a younger Samantha at her father's funeral, supporting her disabled brother while their mother wept. The article mentioned Thomas Davis's unexplained financial troubles and sudden business collapse. His phone buzzed a text from Samantha. Can we talk? Something feels wrong about Victoria's sudden appearance. Looking at her message, Michael felt the weight of generational sins pressing down on him. His family hadn't just acquired a struggling company, they'd deliberately destroyed a good man's life's work. The ripple effects had devastated not just Thomas Davis, but his entire family. Samantha's dedication to Sunnyside, her initial distrust of him, everything took on new meaning. A final document caught his eye, a handwritten letter from his grandfather to Thomas Davis, dated the day before the takeover was finalized. It had never been sent. Tom, I've just learned of James's actions. This is not how I built this company, not the legacy I intended. I will make this right. The sound of heels clicking on marble made him look up. Sarah, his assistant, stood in the doorway, her expression grave. Mr. Johnson, I found something else you need to see. It's about your father's involvement with Victoria Sinclair 5 years ago. Michael stared at the photograph in his hands, Samantha's young face etched with grief, and made a decision. Send everything you found to my private email, Sarah, and get me Harold Finch, my grandfather's lawyer, on the phone. So Sarah hesitated. There's more. Mrs. Henderson from Sunnyside just called. Victoria Sinclair was there today talking to the board members about financial irregularities. She's building a case, not just against Sunnyside, but against Samantha personally. The pieces clicked into place. Victoria wasn't just attacking Sunnyside or his position at Lancaster Consortium. She was going after Samantha, using the past as ammunition. Michael stood, gathering the damning documents. The truth about Davis Sons could destroy his family's reputation, but keeping it hidden would make him complicit in his father's crimes. The evening sun cast long shadows across Sunnyside's main hall as the community gathered for an emergency meeting. News of Victoria's allegations had spread quickly, bringing together an unlikely alliance of residents, volunteers, and local business owners. The room hummed with determination as Samantha stood before them, her voice steady despite the strain visible in her eyes. "They're trying to discredit us," she explained, addressing the packed room. "MS Sinclair claims our financial records show irregularities, that we've mismanaged funds." The crowd stirred angrily, but Samantha raised her hand for quiet. "We know the truth. Every dollar that passes through Sunnyside helps someone in need. Every program changes lives." Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her aged voice carrying surprising authority. "I've kept the books here for 20 years. Everything is documented, every receipt filed. We have nothing to hide." She produced a stack of meticulously maintained ledgers, years of careful record-keeping testament to their integrity. Jake Martinez, now a symbol of Sunnyside's impact, stood next. "Before this place, I was headed nowhere fast. Now I'm getting college acceptance letters." He pulled out an envelope from Yale, brandishing it like a banner. "They can't put a price on what Sunnyside gives us." One by one, community members rose to share their stories. Maria Rodriguez detailed how the center's food program had sustained dozens of families through hard times. Tom Foster, the retired electrician, outlined years of maintenance records showing their careful stewardship of limited resources. Each testimony built upon the last, weaving a tapestry of lives transformed. Then Michael Johnson walked in. The room fell silent as he made his way to the front, carrying a briefcase full of documents. He looked different from the corporate executive they'd first met, his tie loosened, his usual polish replaced by grim determination. "I've spent the day investigating Victoria Sinclair's claims," he announced. "They're not just false, they're deliberately fabricated. She's trying to destroy Sunnyside." Because he paused, meeting Samantha's eyes, "because she knows how much it means to me. To all of us." The subtle shift in his words from "me" to "us" didn't go unnoticed. Mrs. Henderson smiled knowingly as Michael continued, laying out a plan of defense. Local business owners pledged pro bono legal support. Community members organized teams to gather testimonials and evidence of Sunnyside's impact. "We need to show Lancaster Consortium's board the real value of this place," Michael explained. "Not in dollars and cents, but in human terms they can't ignore." Emma Chen, the single mother, stepped forward, clutching her nursing textbooks. "I can speak at the board meeting. Tell them how Sunnyside's childcare program made my education possible." The momentum built as more people volunteered. The Williams family offered to open their home-based printing business for flyers and petitions. University students promised social media support. Even the local press, represented by a veteran reporter whose own children had benefited from Sunnyside's programs, pledged to investigate Victoria's claims. As the meeting concluded, the atmosphere had transformed from fear to fierce resolve. Samantha watched in amazement as her community, the very people Victoria had tried to discredit, mobilized with remarkable efficiency. Each person found their role in the fight to save their beloved center. Michael caught her eye across the room, and in that moment they shared an understanding. This wasn't just about defending against Victoria's accusations or saving a building. It was about protecting a living, breathing ecosystem of hope and mutual support. The very thing his grandfather had wanted him to discover. Together Samantha addressed the dispersing crowd, her voice thick with emotion. "We are stronger than any threat. Tomorrow we show Lancaster Consortium what community really means." The morning headlines hit Sunnyside like a thunderbolt. Community center director accused of embezzlement. Victoria Sinclair's machinations had materialized with devastating precision, the story appearing simultaneously across multiple news outlets. The carefully crafted narrative painted Samantha Davis as a skilled manipulator who had deceived both her community and Michael Johnson. Inside Lancaster Consortium's boardroom, Victoria presented her evidence with surgical precision. "Financial records show systematic discrepancies over the past 3 years," she announced, distributing detailed reports to the board members. Funds designated for community programs were redirected through a series of sophisticated transactions. Michael watched as his fellow board members examined the documents. The fabrication was masterful bank statements, audit reports, and witness testimonies woven into a compelling narrative of deceit. Victoria had even produced photographs of Samantha meeting with known criminal elements, though Michael recognized the images as heavily edited. Furthermore, Victoria continued, her voice carrying calculated concern, Ms. Davis's relationship with Mr. Johnson appears to be part of a long-term strategy. Her father's connection to Lancaster Consortium provided motive, while her position at Sunnyside offered opportunity. Richard Hawthorne cleared his throat. The evidence is compelling, Mr. Johnson. What do you have to say in Ms. Davis's defense? Before Michael could respond, the boardroom door opened. 2 police officers entered, accompanied by the district attorney. We have a warrant for Samantha Davis's arrest, the senior officer announced. Based on evidence provided by Ms. Sinclair's legal team. Michael stood, his chair scraping back. This is absurd. Samantha has dedicated her life to Sunnyside. The financial records have been verified by 3 independent auditors, Victoria interrupted smoothly. Really, Michael, your judgment has been compromised. First by your grandfather's ultimatum, then by Ms. Davis's careful manipulation. The district attorney stepped forward, adding formal weight to the accusations. We have evidence of systematic fraud, Mr. Johnson. Multiple witness statements suggest Ms. Davis used her relationship with you to deflect scrutiny from her activities. Michael watched helplessly as the police departed for Sunnyside. His phone buzzed continuously, messages from community members, press inquiries, and finally a single text from Samantha, they're here. Don't let them destroy what we've built. Victoria approached him as the board members filed out, her perfume a cloying presence. You should thank me, Michael, she murmured. I've saved you from a rather embarrassing scandal. Once the dust settles, we can proceed with the development as planned. But Michael had seen something in the files. Victoria presented a subtle discrepancy that tickled his memory. The banking records showed transactions through First Miami Bank, the same institution that had helped destroy Thomas Davis's company a decade ago. Sarah, he called to his assistant, get me everything we have on First Miami Bank's involvement in the Davis Sons acquisition, and contact Harold Finch. My grandfather must have kept records of his own investigations. Victoria's smile faltered slightly. The past is irrelevant, Michael. Focus on saving your position here. The board votes tomorrow on your leadership. But Michael was already moving, his mind racing ahead. The fabricated evidence against Samantha was too perfect, too comprehensive. Victoria had been planning this for months, perhaps years, which meant somewhere there was a trail leading back to the truth. His phone rang, Mrs. Henderson's number. They've taken her, Michael, the elderly woman's voice cracked. But Victoria made a mistake. I found something in the old records, something about your father and First Miami Bank. As he rushed toward the elevator, Michael caught his reflection in the polished doors. The Ice King was gone, replaced by a man who finally understood what his grandfather had been trying to teach him. Success wasn't measured in property deals or profit margins, but in the lives you touched and the truths you were willing to fight for. The atmosphere at Sunnyside Community Center had transformed overnight. Where warmth and solidarity once reigned, suspicion now crept through the halls like a poisonous fog. The morning's newspaper lay scattered across tables in the main hall, its damning headlines spawning whispered conversations and sidelong glances. Several long-time volunteers had already called to take a break, their carefully worded messages barely masking their fear of association with scandal. The children's art program sat empty, parents having quietly collected their young ones without meeting anyone's eyes. Even the usually bustling community kitchen felt abandoned, with Maria Rodriguez working alone, her normally cheerful demeanor replaced by worried silence. Emma Chen, who had passionately defended Sunnyside just days before, now stood before the hastily assembled emergency committee. "My nursing school called," she announced, her voice trembling. "They're concerned about my character references from Samantha. I could lose my scholarship." The revelation sent ripples through the gathered group. Others began sharing similar stories: job opportunities suddenly questioned, grant applications suspended, partner organizations reviewing their relationships with Sunnyside. The very programs that had transformed lives now seemed tainted by association. Mrs. Henderson attempted to maintain order, but even her steadfast presence couldn't completely quell the growing unrest. "We know Samantha," she insisted, her voice carrying decades of conviction. "Everything she's done has been for this community." "But do we really know her?" Tom Foster countered, the retired electrician's face lined with doubt. The financial records Victoria Sinclair showed, all those transactions, and her father's connection to Lancaster Consortium. Was she using us for revenge all along? The betrayal cut deeper because of how much they had invested in Sunnyside, not just money, but trust, hope, and countless volunteer hours. The center had been their sanctuary, and now that sanctuary felt compromised. When Michael arrived, the usual greetings were notably absent. Jake Martinez, who had looked up to him as a mentor, turned away, unable to meet his eyes. The teenager's college acceptance letter, proudly displayed just yesterday, had been taken down from the bulletin board. "The board members are right," someone whispered loudly enough to be heard. He was blinded by her, probably part of her plan all along. Michael stood in the center of the room, feeling the weight of their judgment. These were people he had come to respect, whose stories had changed his perspective on what truly mattered. Now they viewed him either as a fool or a co-conspirator. "I understand your doubts," he began, but Richard Hawthorne chose that moment to enter, flanked by Lancaster Consortium security. By order of the board, Hawthorne announced with barely concealed satisfaction, "Sunnyside Community Center is temporarily closed pending investigation. All programs are suspended effective immediately." The community's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. Parents clutched children closer. Elderly residents supported each other as the implications sank in. For many, Sunnyside was their only lifeline, the only place that offered hope in an increasingly unaffordable city. Maria emerged from the kitchen, her apron still dusted with flour. "What about the children who depend on our meals?" she demanded. "The seniors who need their medication monitored. The students who have nowhere else to go after school." Hawthorne's response was corporate cold. "Alternative arrangements will be communicated through appropriate channels." As security began ushering people out, Michael watched the community he had grown to love fracture before his eyes. Mrs. Henderson stood alone by the front desk, her hands trembling as she locked up for what might be the last time. The sight of her carefully wiping tears broke something in his heart. Outside, Victoria Sinclair observed the exodus from her parked luxury car, a slight smile playing at her lips. She had achieved what money and power alone could not. She had broken, not just Sunnyside's operations, but its spirit. Yet in the midst of this devastation, Michael noticed something subtle: Mrs. Henderson passing a worn ledger to Jake, who slipped it into his backpack before disappearing down a side street. Even in their doubt, some still fought to protect Sunnyside's truth. In the dim light of his grandfather's home office, Michael Johnson methodically sifted through decades of private correspondence and business records. Harold Finch, his grandfather's lawyer, sat across from him, their shared purpose evident in the intensity of their search. The mahogany-paneled room, unchanged since Arthur Johnson's time, seemed to hold secrets in every shadow. "Your grandfather kept detailed records of everything that troubled him," Finch explained, pulling out a leather-bound journal dated 5 years ago. He was particularly concerned about Victoria Sinclair's sudden interest in Lancaster Consortium during your engagement. The journal entries revealed a pattern that had escaped notice at the time. Victoria's arrival in Miami had coincided with a series of suspicious property acquisitions through shell companies. each transaction bore striking similarities to the tactics used against Thomas Davis's company. "Look at this," Michael said, spreading out banking records from First Miami Bank. The same financial instruments, the same pressure points. Victoria didn't just learn from our takeover of Davis Sons, she was involved somehow. Further investigation uncovered a connection that made Michael's blood run cold. Before coming to Miami, Victoria had worked briefly at Reynolds Banking Group, the same institution that had helped strangle Davis Sons' credit lines. Her mentor, there had been none other than James Johnson, Michael's father. "There's more," Finch said quietly, producing a sealed envelope. "Your grandfather wrote this the day before his ultimatum. He instructed me to share it only if circumstances demanded." Inside, they found photographs documenting clandestine meetings between Victoria and James Johnson dating back to before Michael's engagement. Sarah, Michael's assistant, entered with urgent news. "Sir, I've traced the financial records Victoria used to frame Samantha. They were created using software licensed to a subsidiary of Sinclair Developments. The timestamps show systematic manipulation." Working through the night, they pieced together Victoria's elaborate scheme. She had orchestrated the original attack on Davis Sons, using Michael's father's position and influence. The failed takeover attempt of Lancaster Consortium had been a smokescreen designed to distance her from suspicion while she built her own real estate empire through similar predatory tactics. But why target Sunnyside now? Michael wondered aloud, studying a map of recent development projects. The answer emerged from property records. Victoria had been systematically acquiring land around the community center, positioning herself to profit enormously from its destruction. A text message from Jake illuminated another piece of the puzzle. The teenager had discovered old letters in Mrs. Henderson's ledger, exchanged between Thomas Davis and Arthur Johnson. They revealed that Michael's grandfather had been secretly supporting Sunnyside through anonymous donations, trying to make amends for his son's actions. Victoria must have found out about the ultimatum. Michael realized. "She's not just after Sunnyside, she's trying to force me out of Lancaster Consortium entirely. With me gone and Samantha discredited, there'd be no one left to protect the community." Dawn was breaking when they finally assembled their evidence. Banking records, property deeds, manipulated documents, and witness statements formed a compelling case against Victoria. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source: a series of emails between Victoria and Michael's father, outlining their long-term strategy to seize control of both Lancaster Consortium and the surrounding communities. "This will destroy my father's reputation," Michael said quietly, staring at the evidence before them. Finch placed a hand on his shoulder. "Your grandfather believed that legacy isn't measured in reputation, but in the choices we make when confronted with truth. The question is, what will you do with this information?" Michael thought of Samantha, unjustly imprisoned, of the Sunnyside community, their trust shattered, of his grandfather's final lesson about the true meaning of success and love. The path forward was clear, but the cost would be enormous. "Prepare everything for the board meeting," he instructed Sarah, "and contact the district attorney. It's time to show Victoria that some things can't be bought or manipulated, like truth, justice, and the power of community." The Miami Police Department's interview room felt unnaturally cold as Michael Johnson faced Detective Sarah Martinez across a steel table. Outside, the media circus had already begun, drawn by the shocking news that Lancaster Consortium's CEO was confessing to financial crimes. "Let me understand this clearly, Mr. Johnson," Detective Martinez said, her pen poised above her notepad. "You're claiming sole responsibility for the financial irregularities at Sunnyside Community Center." Her skepticism was evident in every word, but Michael maintained steady eye contact, his voice unwavering. "The documentation I'm providing proves that I orchestrated the transactions in question. Samantha Davis had no knowledge of these activities. Her arrest was a mistake based on fabricated evidence." He pushed forward a thick folder containing carefully prepared documents. Each paper had been meticulously crafted to suggest his involvement while protecting both Samantha and the true evidence against Victoria. It was a calculated risk, sacrificing himself to buy time for the full investigation. "You understand the severity of these charges?" the detective pressed. "Embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy, you're looking at significant prison time." "I understand completely," Michael replied, thinking of Samantha in her cell, of the shattered community she'd left behind. "I also understand that an innocent woman is being punished for crimes she didn't commit." The detective studied him intently. In her 20 years on the force, she'd seen countless powerful men try to manipulate the system. But something about Johnson's demeanor struck her as different. His confession didn't carry the desperate edge of a man trying to escape justice. Outside the interview room, Harold Finch waited with Michael's prepared statement to the press. The headlines would be devastating. Lancaster's CEO confesses to financial crimes. The board would have no choice but to remove him immediately. His grandfather's deadline would become irrelevant. He would lose everything anyway. As Detective Martinez left to process his confession, Michael was permitted one phone call. He dialed Mrs. Henderson's number, knowing she would understand the message he needed to convey. "They're releasing Samantha within the hour," he said without preamble. "Make sure she doesn't try to stop this. Tell her," his voice caught slightly. "Tell her sometimes love means protecting what matters most, no matter the cost." Mrs. Henderson's response was soft but firm. "She won't accept this sacrifice, Michael. You know that. She has to. The evidence against Victoria needs time to be properly verified. This buys us that time, and it keeps Samantha free to protect Sunnyside." The processing officer arrived to escort him to booking. As they took his fingerprints and photograph, Michael thought of his grandfather's words about the true meaning of legacy. Arthur Johnson had built an empire, but he'd understood that real wealth lay in the lives you touched, the sacrifices you made for those you loved. The media flashbulbs were blinding as they led him out to the transport vehicle. He caught fragments of reporters' questions. "Mr. Johnson, why confess now? Was this related to the Sunnyside development? What about your position at Lancaster Consortium?" But one voice cut through the chaos: Samantha's voice, desperate and angry. She had just been released, still wearing the clothes from her arrest. "Michael, don't do this. I won't let you." Their eyes met across the crowd. In that moment, everything else fell away: the charges, the press, the looming consequences. He saw in her face the same fierce protection she'd always shown her community. But now it was directed at him, and it nearly broke his resolve. The transport door closed between them, but not before she read his lips: "I love you. Trust me." As the vehicle pulled away, Michael closed his eyes, remembering the first time he'd seen Samantha defending Sunnyside. She'd taught him that some things were worth fighting for, worth sacrificing everything to protect. Now he would prove he'd learned that lesson well. In the pre-dawn quiet of Sunnyside Community Center, Samantha Davis packed away her life's work with trembling hands. Each photograph and document she carefully stored represented a memory, a triumph, a piece of her heart she would leave behind. The first light of morning filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the empty halls that had once bustled with life and purpose. Mrs. Henderson found her there, methodically emptying her desk drawer. "So you're really going through with this foolishness?" the elderly woman asked, her voice carrying equal measures of understanding and disapproval. "Michael is in jail because of me," Samantha replied, not meeting her mentor's eyes. "Victoria won't stop until she's destroyed everything we've built. The only way to protect Sunnyside, to protect Michael, is to leave." Her resignation letter lay sealed on the desk, alongside detailed instructions for running each program. She'd spent the night documenting everything, ensuring the community's needs would still be met in her absence. The acceptance letter from a community center in Seattle, a position she'd been offered months ago, would provide the perfect excuse for her departure. "And you think running away will solve anything?" Mrs. Henderson challenged gently. "That boy is sitting in a cell right now, because he believes in you, in what we've built here." Samantha finally looked up, tears threatening to spill. "He's there because of my father's connection to Lancaster Consortium. Victoria is using our past to destroy his future. If I leave, take the scandal with me, maybe the board will reinstate him." The sound of footsteps interrupted them. Jake Martinez stood in the doorway, his young face etched with concern. "Mr. Davis, you can't go. Not now. We found something in the old records about Victoria and Mr. Johnson's father." But Samantha was already shouldering her bag. "Give whatever you found to Harold Finch. He'll know what to do with it," her voice caught as she looked around the office one last time. "The community needs Sunnyside more than it needs me." She made it as far as the front entrance before Emma Chen blocked her path, holding her sleeping child. "When I first came here," Emma said softly, "you told me that running from our problems doesn't solve them. It just gives them power over us." The weight of those words, her own words turned back on her, made Samantha pause. Through the windows she could see community members gathering, families whose lives had intertwined with hers, whose struggles and triumphs she had shared. Maria Rodriguez emerged from the kitchen, carrying a box of Samantha's favorite tea. "You taught us to fight together," the older woman said firmly. "To stand strong when people try to divide us. Was that all just words?" Samantha's carefully constructed resolve began to crumble. She thought of Michael sacrificing everything to protect her and Sunnyside. How could she honor that sacrifice by running away? Mrs. Henderson approached, holding out a worn leather journal. "Before you decide, there's something you need to see. Arthur Johnson, Michael's grandfather, he kept records of everything, including what really happened to your father's company." Samantha stared at the journal, her hand hovering over its weathered cover. Inside could be answers she'd sought for years, but also truths that might change everything she thought she knew about the past. "Sometimes," Mrs. Henderson said gently, "love means staying to fight, even when running seems safer. Michael learned that lesson. Perhaps it's time you did too." The rising sun cast a warm glow through Sunnyside's windows, illuminating the faces of the community that had become her family. In that moment, Samantha Davis made her choice not just about staying or leaving, but about love, trust, and the courage to face whatever truth awaited her. Mrs. Henderson settled into her worn office chair, Arthur Johnson's journal open on her lap. Samantha sat across from her, the morning light casting shadows across their faces as the elderly woman began to share a story 30 years in the making. "I wasn't always just the program director at Sunnyside," Mrs. Henderson began, her fingers tracing the journal's leather binding. "During the war, I was a nurse stationed at the same field hospital as Arthur Johnson. He was badly wounded in an attack that killed most of his unit. I helped save his life." She turned to a dog-eared page, revealing a faded photograph of a young nurse standing beside a soldier in bandages. Arthur never forgot that. When he built Lancaster Consortium, he made a promise to himself that success would never come at the cost of human dignity. Samantha listened intently as Mrs. Henderson revealed how Arthur Johnson had secretly supported Sunnyside for decades through an anonymous foundation. The journal detailed his growing concern over his son James's ruthless business practices, particularly regarding Davis' son's construction. "The day your father's company was taken over," Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice softening, "Arthur was in the hospital for heart surgery. He didn't know what James had planned. When he found out, he was devastated. He tried to make amends, to reach out to your family, but by then my father was gone," Samantha finished quietly, understanding dawning in her eyes. Mrs. Henderson nodded, turning to more recent entries. Arthur watched Michael follow in James's footsteps, becoming harder, colder. The ultimatum, it wasn't just about marriage or inheritance. It was his last attempt to show Michael a different path, to help him rediscover the values that built Lancaster Consortium. The journal's final pages revealed Arthur's deepest fears about Victoria Sinclair's influence and his hope that someone would help Michael remember who he was meant to be. The last entry, dated just before the ultimatum, carried a sense of prophetic certainty. Sometimes love comes disguised as loss. Sometimes we must lose everything to find what truly matters. But there's more, Mrs. Henderson said, reaching into her desk drawer. She withdrew a sealed envelope, Arthur Johnson's distinctive handwriting visible on the front. He left this with me years ago to be opened only when someone proved worthy of Sunnyside's true legacy. Samantha's hands trembled as she accepted the envelope. Inside, she found legal documents transferring ownership of the Sunnyside property to a community trust, along with a substantial endowment for its continued operation. The paperwork was complete, lacking only final signatures. Arthur Johnson didn't just support Sunnyside, Mrs. Henderson explained, watching comprehension dawn on Samantha's face. He protected it, ensuring it would survive long after he was gone. He was waiting for someone who understood its real value not as property to be developed, but as a sanctuary to be preserved. The morning sun had fully risen now, its light filling the small office with warmth. Outside, they could hear the community beginning to gather, drawn by hope and determination rather than despair. Michael's grandfather never lost faith in the power of love to transform lives, Mrs. Henderson concluded, closing the journal gently. He believed that true legacy isn't built on profits or power, but on the lives we touch and the hearts we change. Michael has finally learned that lesson. The question now is, what will you do with this truth? Samantha stood, clutching the documents that could save everything they'd fought for. In that moment she understood that Arthur Johnson had orchestrated a symphony of redemption spanning decades, its final notes still waiting to be played. The Lancaster Consortium boardroom buzzed with tension as Harold Finch stood before the assembled directors, his weathered face grave beneath the fluorescent lights. Michael Johnson, still in his prison uniform, sat between two officers while Victoria Sinclair watched from her usual seat, her composure showing the first signs of strain. "Before we proceed with today's vote," Finch announced, "there's something the board needs to see." He nodded to Sarah, who dimmed the lights and started a video projection. The screen flickered to life, revealing Arthur Johnson's study, where the elderly man sat in his familiar leather chair. "If you're watching this," Arthur's recorded image began, "then events have unfolded as I feared they might." The timestamp showed the video had been recorded just days before his supposed illness. "What I'm about to reveal will change everything you think you know about Lancaster Consortium's future." Victoria shifted uncomfortably as Arthur detailed her early connection to James Johnson, including documented evidence of their conspiracy against Thomas Davis's company. But it was his next revelation that stunned the room into silence. "My illness is not what it appears," Arthur continued. "For the past month I've been working at Sunnyside Community Center under an assumed identity. The elderly volunteer known as Mr. Thompson? That was me." Michael's head snapped up, memories flooding back the quiet man who'd spent hours in the library, who'd watched his interactions with Samantha, who'd seemed so familiar yet impossible to place. The video continued, showing surveillance footage of Victoria's systematic manipulation of financial records, her meetings with corrupt bank officials, and her ultimate plan to seize control of both Lancaster Consortium and the surrounding communities. "I needed to understand what my company had become," Arthur explained. "What I discovered broke my heart but also gave me hope. In Michael's growing relationship with Samantha Davis and his commitment to Sunnyside, I saw the possibility of redemption." Richard Hawthorne stood abruptly. "This is preposterous. Arthur Johnson has been confined to his estate for weeks. His doctors." "Part of the deception," Finch interrupted, producing notarized statements from Arthur's medical team. "Mr. Johnson's health is excellent. The reports of his illness were deliberately fabricated to test how various parties would react." Victoria's carefully maintained facade began to crack. "Even if this is true, it doesn't change the financial realities. Sunnyside is still." His legally protected Samantha's voice rang out as she entered the boardroom, Mrs. Henderson at her side. She carried Arthur's journal and the trust documents, which she placed before the board members. "Arthur Johnson transferred ownership of the property to a community trust months ago. The development plans were never legally viable. The surveillance footage continued playing, showing Arthur's daily interactions at Sunnyside. "I've watched my grandson discover what I learned long ago," his voice continued. "That true success isn't measured in profit margins or property holdings, but in the lives we touch and the communities we build." Michael sat transfixed, remembering every interaction with the quiet elderly volunteer who had witnessed his transformation. His grandfather hadn't just tested him, he had guided him, watching and waiting as Michael learned to see the world through new eyes. The choice before you now, Arthur's recording concluded, is not just about who will lead Lancaster Consortium. It's about what kind of company we will be. My grandson has shown he understands this by being willing to sacrifice everything to protect what matters most. The lights came up, revealing tears in several board members' eyes. Victoria sat rigid, her carefully constructed plans crumbling around her. But it was Michael who spoke first, his voice rough with emotion. "All this time," he said, looking at Mrs. Henderson, "you knew." The elderly woman smiled gently. "Your grandfather believed some lessons can only be learned through experience. He needed to know if you could find your way back to the values that built this company, not because of an ultimatum, but because your heart led you there." As Harold Finch continued presenting evidence to the Lancaster Consortium board, Victoria Sinclair's carefully constructed world began to unravel. The lawyer methodically displayed financial records, surveillance footage, and sworn testimonies that painted a devastating picture of systematic corruption spanning nearly a decade. MS. Sinclair's involvement began earlier than we initially suspected, Finch explained, projecting a series of banking transactions onto the screen. While working at Reynolds Banking Group, she orchestrated the financial strangulation of multiple family-owned businesses, including Davis Sons Construction. Each company's assets were then acquired through shell corporations ultimately controlled by her own investment group. Detective Martinez stepped forward, adding official weight to the proceedings. "We've uncovered evidence of wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy spanning 3 states. The pattern shows a systematic approach to community displacement for profit, with falsified environmental reports, manipulated zoning regulations, and strategic use of insider information." Victoria maintained her composure, but her manicured nails dug crescents into her palms as email exchanges between her and James Johnson appeared on screen. Their correspondence revealed not just the plot against Thomas Davis, but a broader conspiracy to seize control of Lancaster Consortium through Michael's planned marriage to Victoria. "The attempted hostile takeover 5 years ago was merely a smokescreen," Finch continued. While attention focused on that obvious threat, MS. Sinclair quietly accumulated properties around targeted communities, including Sunnyside. The real estate portfolio she built through these manipulations is worth hundreds of millions. Richard Hawthorne, who had staunchly supported Victoria's plans, now stared at her with undisguised revulsion. The evidence showed she had been secretly recording their private conversations, planning to use them as leverage once she controlled the company. "Most damning," Detective Martinez added, "is the proof of MS. Sinclair's recent activities. The falsified evidence against Samantha Davis was created using sophisticated software traced to one of her shell companies. Moreover, we've found proof of systematic bribes to banking officials, including recent transfers to key figures at First Miami Bank." Victoria finally spoke, her voice carrying a hint of desperation beneath its usual polish. "This is clearly a fabrication. Arthur Johnson's theatrical performance doesn't change the basic economics of the situation. Lancaster Consortium's shareholders have been protected," Finch interrupted, producing another document. "Mr. Johnson's precautions included detailed documentation of your attempts to manipulate stock prices through false information. The SEC has opened a formal investigation." The district attorney stepped into the boardroom, accompanied by additional officers. "Victoria Sinclair," he announced formally, "you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and multiple violations of federal banking regulations." As Victoria was led away in handcuffs, Her perfectly maintained facade finally cracked. "Everything I did, I learned from Lancaster Consortium," she spat bitterly. "You can't arrest me for playing by the rules you created." Michael stood, despite his own restraints. "The difference," he said quietly, "is that we learn to change those rules. To understand that true success isn't built on destroying communities, but on helping them thrive." The board members watched in stunned silence as Victoria was escorted out. The woman who had nearly succeeded in destroying both Lancaster Consortium and Sunnyside Community Centre had been undone not by force, but by the patient accumulation of truth. Samantha, standing beside Mrs. Henderson, felt a complex mix of emotions. Victoria's arrest wouldn't bring her father back, but it offered a kind of closure she hadn't known she needed. More importantly, it represented a turning point, a chance for real change in how business and community interests could align. In the quiet of Sunnyside's library, long after Victoria's arrest and the board's dramatic session, Samantha Davis sat across from Michael Johnson, her hands clasped tightly around a worn envelope. The evening light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the space where their story had begun. "There's something I need to tell you," Samantha began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "When I first learned Lancaster Consortium was targeting Sunnyside, I saw it as an opportunity. Not just to save the centre, but to expose the company that had destroyed my father's life." Michael watched her carefully, his prison uniform a stark reminder of everything that had changed. "You plan to use me," he said softly, "not as an accusation, but as an acknowledgement." Samantha nodded, withdrawing documents from the envelope. "I had collected evidence about Davis Sons' takeover for years. Every legal filing, every bank record, every newspaper clipping. When you arrived at Sunnyside, I thought. You thought I would be like my father," Michael finished. "Like Victoria." "I was wrong," Samantha continued, her voice thick with emotion. "Watching you with our community, seeing how you changed, understanding your own struggles with your family's legacy, I realized I was fighting the wrong battle. The past had blinded me to the possibility of real change." She spread the documents, between them years of meticulous research into Lancaster Consortium's business practices. "I could have used these at any time, could have gone to the press, tried to force the company's hand. But somewhere along the way, revenge stopped mattering. What started as a plan to destroy Lancaster Consortium became a chance to transform it." Michael reached across the table, taking her hands in his. "When did you know," he asked, "that this was more than just strategy?" Samantha's eyes met his, filled with both regret and hope. "The day you spent hours helping Jake with his college applications. You weren't the Ice King anymore, you were just a man who cared enough to make a difference. That's when I knew I was falling in love with who you really are, not who I'd assumed you would be." "Your father would be proud," Michael said gently. "Not of the revenge plan, but of how you chose to let it go. Of everything you've built here at Sunnyside." Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, carrying Arthur Johnson's journal. "Sometimes," she observed wisely, "the best revenge is proving that change is possible. That love can transform even the deepest wounds into opportunities for healing." Samantha touched the journal reverently. "Your grandfather understood that. He saw past my initial motives, trusted that both of us could learn to see beyond our pain." Michael stood, moving around the table to kneel beside Samantha's chair. "So here we are," he said softly. "Both of us started with plans for revenge or protection, and both of us found something far more valuable." "Here we are," Samantha agreed, tears finally spilling over. "No more secrets, no more plans, just truth." Mrs. Henderson quietly withdrew, leaving them alone in the growing dusk. Through the windows they could see Sunnyside's evening programs beginning, families gathering, children laughing, a community continuing to thrive despite all attempts to destroy it. "What happens now?" Samantha whispered, her hand finding Michael's. "Now," he replied, "we build something new, together. Not because of ultimatums or revenge, but because we choose to." As night fell over Miami, the library of Sunnyside Community Center held two people who had begun as enemies, transformed into allies, and finally discovered that love's greatest victory isn't in changing others, but in allowing ourselves to be changed. The morning after Victoria's arrest, Sunnyside Community Center witnessed an unprecedented gathering. The main hall overflowed with residents, volunteers, and local business owners, all responding to Mrs. Henderson's emergency call. The atmosphere crackled with renewed purpose as people who had briefly doubted their community's integrity now stood united, determined to right the wrongs of the past weeks. Michael Johnson, recently released on bail pending the investigation's resolution, stood before them not as Lancaster Consortium CEO, but as a member of their community. His prison uniform had been replaced by clothes borrowed from Jake's father, a visible symbol of how far the Ice King had come from his corporate tower. The charges against me will be dropped once the evidence of Victoria's manipulation is processed, Michael explained, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed room. But that's not why we're here. We're here because Sunnyside taught all of us what real community means. Emma Chen stepped forward, her nursing textbooks clutched to her chest. When the scandal broke, I almost lost my scholarship, she announced. But my professors received letters from every senior citizen I've helped through Sunnyside's health monitoring program. They vouched for my character, shared stories of our work here. The university not only reinstated my scholarship but has offered to establish a community health partnership with Sunnyside. One by one, similar stories emerged. The Williams family's printing business had received orders from companies across Miami, placed by people who remembered Sunnyside's impact on their own lives. Local restaurants that had temporarily suspended their food donations now pledged permanent support, inspired by Maria Rodriguez's unwavering dedication to feeding their community. Samantha watched in amazement as Jake Martinez unveiled a website he and other teenagers had created, documenting Sunnyside's 30-year history of community service. We've collected hundreds of testimonials, he explained proudly. People from all over Miami sharing how this place changed their lives. They're not just defending Sunnyside, they're becoming part of its future. Mrs. Henderson, standing beside Arthur Johnson's portrait newly hung in the main hall, announced the formation of the Sunnyside Community Trust. Thanks to Arthur's foresight and Michael's commitment, this center will never again face the threat of development. But more than that, we're establishing a model for how business and community interests can work together. Local media representatives, who had once rushed to publish Victoria's accusations, now crowded the entrance, eager to document this story of redemption and renewal. But it was the quiet moments that truly illustrated Sunnyside's triumph: elderly residents helping young mothers with childcare, teenagers tutoring children in the computer lab, business owners offering job training and apprenticeships. This, Michael said softly to Samantha as they watched their community in action, this is what my grandfather meant about real legacy. Not buildings or profit margins, but people coming together, making life better for each other. Samantha squeezed his hand, understanding that their personal journey of forgiveness and love had become part of something larger, a testament to the power of community to heal old wounds and build new bridges. As morning turned to afternoon, the gathering transformed into an impromptu celebration of renewal. Maria's kitchen produced a feast, children decorated the walls with fresh artwork, and the sound of laughter echoed through halls that had briefly known doubt and fear. Sunnyside hadn't just survived its crisis, it had emerged stronger, its bonds deepened by the challenge they had weathered together. In Michael's grandfather's study, two families gathered to confront decades of pain and misunderstanding. Samantha sat beside her mother Helen, who had insisted on coming despite her fragile health, while Jimmy, her brother, positioned his wheelchair near the fireplace. Across from them, Michael and Arthur Johnson completed the circle, with Mrs. Henderson present as both witness and mediator. Arthur Johnson, no longer maintaining his facade of illness, addressed Helen Davis first. I've waited years for this opportunity, he began, his voice carrying the weight of long-held regret. Your husband Thomas was more than just another businessman. He represented everything I had hoped Lancaster Consortium would stand for: integrity, community value, human dignity. Helen Davis's hands trembled slightly as she withdrew an old photograph from her purse. It showed Thomas Davis and Arthur Johnson at a community groundbreaking ceremony, both men smiling, their sleeves rolled up as they worked alongside their crews. "Tom spoke often of your early partnership," she said softly. "He believed in building homes, not just houses." "The day James orchestrated the takeover," Arthur continued, "I was recovering from heart surgery. By the time I learned the truth, the damage was done. My own son had betrayed not just your family, but everything our company was meant to represent." Jimmy Davis, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. "Dad used to say that a man's legacy isn't in the buildings he builds, but in the lives he touches." His words hung in the air, bridging past and present with profound simplicity. Michael moved to kneel before Helen Davis, meeting her eyes directly. "I can't undo what my father did," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I can promise you this: from this day forward, Lancaster Consortium will honor your husband's vision. Every project will prioritize community impact over profit margins." Tears slipped down Helen's cheeks as she reached out to touch Michael's face. "You have your grandfather's heart," she observed. "Tom would have liked the man you become." Arthur Johnson produced a leather portfolio containing documents that would restore the Davis family's stake in several community development projects. "This can't bring Thomas back," he acknowledged, "but it can ensure his legacy lives on through the work we do together." Mrs. Henderson, who had witnessed both families' pain over the years, spoke from her place by the fire. "Sometimes healing requires more than justice," she said wisely. "It needs understanding, forgiveness, and the courage to build something new from the ashes of the old." Samantha watched as her mother and brother reviewed the documents, seeing in their faces the same transformation she had experienced: the gradual replacement of bitterness with hope. The room that had begun the evening heavy with history's weight now felt lighter, filled with possibility. "Dad always said business was about relationships," Jimmy reflected, looking between his sister and Michael. "I don't think this is what he meant, but I think he'd approve." Laughter broke the remaining tension, and as the evening progressed, stories began to flow. Helen shared memories of Thomas's early days in construction, while Arthur recalled their shared dreams for Miami's future. Through their words, Thomas Davis emerged not as a victim of corporate greed, but as a visionary whose principles had finally found their moment of vindication. As darkness fell outside, two families once divided by tragedy found themselves united by a shared commitment to honor the past by building a better future. The Lancaster Consortium boardroom had been transformed. Gone was the imposing mahogany table, replaced by a circular arrangement that fostered dialogue rather than hierarchy. Michael Johnson sat among board members, community leaders, and Sunnyside residents as they crafted a new vision for corporate community partnership. "Traditional development metrics aren't sufficient," Michael explained, gesturing to the presentation screens displaying their innovative framework. "We're implementing a community impact assessment that weighs social value alongside financial returns. Every project must demonstrate positive outcomes for existing residents." Richard Hawthorne, who had once opposed these changes, now leaned forward with interest. "The preliminary data from Sunnyside is compelling. Their job training program has placed 37 residents in skilled positions, generating sustainable economic growth while preserving community bonds." Samantha Davis, officially appointed as Director of Community Relations, presented case studies demonstrating how their approach could be replicated across Miami. "When we invest in people first," she emphasized, "the financial success follows naturally. Our pilot programs have shown a 30% increase in local business revenue since implementing support services." The transformation extended beyond policies and procedures. Lancaster Consortium's employees now regularly volunteered at Sunnyside, breaking down barriers between corporate and community interests. Junior executives mentored local youth, while community members shared invaluable insights about neighborhood needs and opportunities. Arthur Johnson, watching from his position as Chairman Emeritus, observed how trust grew through action rather than promises. Each successful collaboration strengthened the foundation for future partnerships. The cynicism that had once characterized corporate community relations gave way to cautious optimism, then active engagement. "We're not just changing how we do business," Michael noted during a quarterly review session. "We're redefining what success looks like. Our shareholders are seeing that social responsibility and profitability aren't mutually exclusive." The evidence supported his assertion. Lancaster Consortium's new approach had attracted socially conscious investors, while positive media coverage enhanced their brand value. More importantly, their projects now garnered community support rather than resistance, streamlining development processes and reducing costs. Mrs. Henderson, serving on the newly established Community Advisory Board, helped ensure accountability remained at the forefront. "Trust is earned in drops and lost in buckets," she often reminded them. "Each decision must reinforce our commitment to balanced growth." The most significant transformation appeared in daily interactions. Where suspicion had once colored every exchange, open dialogue now prevailed. Community members felt empowered to voice concerns, knowing they would be heard and addressed. Corporate representatives approached neighborhoods as partners rather than obstacles to overcome. During one evening session, as they reviewed plans for expanding their model to other communities, Jake Martinez captured the essence of their achievement. "Before we saw Lancaster Consortium as the enemy," the young man observed. "Now we understand that true progress happens when everyone has a seat at the table." This new understanding manifested in practical ways. The company's resources, once deployed solely for profit, now supported community initiatives. Technical expertise merged with local knowledge to create solutions that served all stakeholders. The result was a dynamic partnership that promised sustainable growth while preserving neighborhood character and cohesion. As the sun set over Miami, casting long shadows through the boardroom windows, Michael and Samantha exchanged glances. They had not just built trust between two entities, they had created a blueprint for how business and community could thrive together, each strengthening the other through genuine partnership and shared purpose. The Miami courthouse stood imposing against the morning sky as Victoria Sinclair made her final bid for freedom. The prosecution had built an airtight case, but Victoria had one last card to play. As Michael and Samantha entered the courtroom, they found her poised and elegant despite her prison attire, her demeanor suggesting she still held power over the proceedings. "Before the court renders its decision," Victoria announced, "I have evidence that will demonstrate the true nature of Lancaster Consortium's operations, including Arthur Johnson's own involvement in questionable practices spanning decades." The courtroom tensed as Victoria's attorney produced a series of documents. "These records," he declared, "show systematic manipulation of property values and community displacement long before my client's involvement. The Johnson family, including both Arthur and Michael, built their empire on the same principles they now condemn." Michael stood, addressing the court with quiet authority. "Your Honor, we don't dispute the existence of these records. In fact, we supplied them to the prosecution ourselves. Lancaster Consortium's history includes chapters we're not proud of, but we're committed to writing a different future." Victoria's composure cracked slightly. "You're destroying everything we built," she hissed. "The empire your father and I envisioned. We could have controlled every prime property in Miami." "That was never my grandfather's vision," Michael responded, his voice carrying to every corner of the hushed courtroom. "He understood something my father forgot, and you never learned that true success isn't measured in property portfolios, but in lives improved." The prosecutor stepped forward, presenting the complete evidence of Victoria's crimes. Bank records showed systematic fraud. Surveillance footage captured bribes being exchanged. Former employees testified about falsified documents and coerced signatures. MS. Sinclair didn't just commit financial crimes, the prosecutor explained. She attempted to destroy a community center that serves hundreds of families. She tried to frame an innocent woman for her own misdeeds. She betrayed not just her fiduciary duties, but basic human decency. Victoria stood suddenly, her careful facade finally shattering. "You're all fools," she declared, facing Michael and Samantha. "Sentiment has no place in business. Your precious community center, your social programs, their weaknesses waiting to be exploited. I showed you who you could become." "No, Victoria," Michael replied softly. "You showed us who we chose not to be." The judge's gavel fell with decisive finality. Victoria Sinclair was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, with additional penalties including full restitution to her victims. As officers led her away, she turned one last time to Michael. "Your father would be ashamed of you," she spat. "Perhaps," Michael acknowledged, "but my grandfather is proud, and that matters more." Outside the courthouse, sunshine broke through Miami's morning clouds. Reporters gathered, eager to document the fall of the woman who had nearly destroyed both Lancaster Consortium and Sunnyside Community Center. But Michael and Samantha slipped away quietly, leaving the media circus behind. "It's really over," Samantha said as they walked toward Sunnyside, where their community waited to hear the news. "Not over," Michael corrected gently. "Just beginning." Victoria represented the past, what business could be at its worst. We get to show what it can be at its best. The shadow of Victoria's influence had finally lifted, leaving them free to build something new on a foundation of trust, community, and shared purpose. In his grandfather's study, Michael Johnson stood before the family portrait that had witnessed his journey. The painting captured 3 generations of Johnson men: his grandfather Arthur, his father James, and himself as a young boy. But the reflection in the window beside it showed a very different Michael than the one who had received that life-changing ultimatum weeks ago. "Remarkable how much can change in such a short time," Arthur observed, joining his grandson. The elder Johnson moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had orchestrated not just a business succession, but a profound personal transformation. "I keep thinking about that first day at Sunnyside," Michael reflected, adjusting his tie, no longer a symbol of corporate armor, but a simple accessory. "I was so certain about everything business, success, what legacy meant. Now—" He gestured to the development plans spread across his grandfather's desk, each one incorporating community impact assessments and social benefit metrics. Arthur picked up one of the proposals, a mixed-income housing development that would preserve existing neighborhoods while creating new opportunities for growth. "You've achieved something far more valuable than mere profit," he noted. "You've discovered how to align business success with human dignity." The changes in Michael extended beyond his professional approach. Where the Ice King had once stood rigid with carefully controlled authority, this new Michael moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. His smile, once reserved for boardroom victories, now appeared naturally and frequently. "Lancaster Consortium's quarterly reports show something interesting," Arthur continued, producing a folder of financial statements. "Our new community-first approach has actually increased profitability. It seems treating people with respect makes good business sense." Michael nodded, remembering the lessons learned in Sunnyside's cramped offices and busy hallways. "Success doesn't have to come at someone else's expense," he said, echoing words he'd heard from Samantha. "When we lift communities, we all rise together." The transformation had rippled through every aspect of his life. His relationships with employees had deepened from mere authority to genuine mentorship. The corporate hierarchy had flattened, with decisions now shaped by input from all levels, including community representatives. Even his father's old office, once a fortress of isolation, had been converted into a community meeting space where residents could directly engage with corporate leadership. The walls that had once displayed stock certificates now showcased photographs of successful community initiatives and testimonials from lives improved. "Your sister Emily would be proud," Arthur said softly, touching the family portrait. She always said you had a heart bigger than your ambitions. She just couldn't get you to believe it." Michael felt the familiar pang at Emily's memory, but now it came with acceptance rather than guilt. "She saw what Samantha helped me rediscover. That true strength lies in connecting with people, not controlling them." The sun was setting over Miami, casting a warm glow through the study windows. In its light, Michael could clearly see the contrast between the man he had been and the one he had become. The Ice King had melted, revealing not weakness, but a deeper, more sustainable kind of strength. "The ultimatum," Michael said, turning to his grandfather. "It was never really about marriage or inheritance, was it?" Arthur smiled, the wisdom of his plan evident in his eyes. "It was about giving you a reason to look beyond the walls you'd built. The rest your transformation, finding love, rediscovering purpose that was all you." On a bright Miami morning, Sunnyside Community Center bustled with unprecedented activity. The once weathered building, now tastefully renovated while preserving its historic character, hosted a dual celebration, the launch of the Johnson Davis Community Development Initiative, and a more personal milestone for the two people who had made it possible. In the main hall, transformed by the community's artistic touches, Michael Johnson stood before a gathering that bridged two worlds. Lancaster Consortium's board members sat alongside Sunnyside residents. Corporate executives mingled with community leaders. Helen Davis shared proud tears with Arthur Johnson as they watched their children prepare to address the assembly. "A few months ago," Michael began, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of hard-won wisdom, "I thought I knew everything about success, about legacy, about love." He glanced at Samantha, who stood beside him, their fingers intertwined. "I had never been more wrong or more ready to learn." Samantha stepped forward, continuing their shared narrative. "We came together through conflict, driven by different purposes. But we discovered something profound, that true change happens when we stop seeing each other as obstacles and start recognizing our shared humanity." The Johnson Davis Initiative, they explained, would expand Sunnyside's model across Miami. Each project would combine business expertise with community wisdom, ensuring development served existing residents rather than displacing them. The program included affordable housing, education initiatives, and small business support, all structured to preserve neighborhood integrity while fostering sustainable growth. Mrs. Henderson, now Director of Community Relations for the initiative, dabbed at her eyes as Michael and Samantha revealed the program's cornerstone, the Thomas Davis Memorial Scholarship, providing education and entrepreneurship opportunities to community members. The first recipient? Jake Martinez, headed to Yale with dreams of studying urban development and social justice. But today celebrates more than just new programs, Arthur Johnson announced, rising to address the gathering. It celebrates the power of love to transform not just hearts, but entire communities. He nodded to the minister waiting quietly at the side of the hall. As Michael and Samantha turned to face each other, their formal attire now taking on new meaning, the gathered community witnessed a union that symbolized more than just marriage. It represented the bridging of divisions, the healing of old wounds, and the promise of a future built on understanding and shared purpose. "The greatest legacy," Michael said softly as they exchanged vows, "isn't what we build with bricks and mortar, but what we build with love and trust." Samantha's response carried the wisdom of their journey, and the strongest communities are built not by avoiding differences, but by embracing them with open hearts. As afternoon sun streamed through Sunnyside's windows, casting a warm glow over the celebration, the gathered community recognized they were witnessing not just a wedding, but the beginning of a new chapter in their shared story. The Ice King had not merely thought, he had been transformed by the very warmth he had once feared. Maria's Kitchen produced a feast that combined corporate catering with community recipes. Children played alongside business executives. Music and laughter filled halls that had once echoed with uncertainty and fear. In every corner of Sunnyside, the future they had fought for was already taking shape. As Michael and Samantha shared their first dance, surrounded by the family they had found and the community they had united, they embodied a truth greater than any business success that love, when anchored in purpose and commitment to others, has the power to transform not just individuals, but entire worlds. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this transformative story of love, redemption, and community empowerment. What resonated most with you, Michael's journey from the Ice King to community champion, Samantha's path from seeking revenge to finding love, or the power of a community standing together against corporate greed? Share your perspective in the comments below. If you value stories that explore the intersection of business and social responsibility while celebrating the triumph of human connection, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. We're committed to bringing you powerful narratives that inspire positive change and demonstrate how love can transform both individuals and communities. Found meaning in Michael and Samantha's journey? Help spread these important messages about corporate responsibility, community empowerment, and the transformative power of love. Share this story with friends who believe in the possibility of positive change, even in the most unlikely circumstances. Together, we can inspire more leaders to prioritize both profit and purpose,